Hello and welcome to Smaulgld. In case you missed it, top gold and silver stories for the week ended June 24th, 2017. Supreme Court, offensive speech ban offends the Constitution. Supreme Court rules that hate speech cannot be banned by the U.S. Patent Office. Other stories we're going to cover today: are we moving towards a trustless society where code is law? Italian banks in trouble. Florida man to be fined $120 million for robocalls. India legalizes Bitcoin. And U.S. mint sales remain dismal as cryptocurrency trading volumes remain robust. Top stories of the week: the Supreme Court ruled on offensive speech and handed First Amendment proponents a victory. In the Trump spy saga, which continued during the week, we saw former FBI Director James Comey visit the New York Times. We also learned of a leak that former President Obama knew of Russian interference but did nothing other than to personally tell Vladimir Putin to knock it off. So that whole story continues to have legs, and we'll see where that heads. Now, let's talk about the Supreme Court unanimous decision, which is very important because it impacts what people say, who can tell you what to say, who can tell you what not to say, and so on. So it was a case, Mittal versus Tam. And this gentleman, Tam, had a band, and he had called his band the name The Slants, which is a derogatory term. And he wanted his band to be registered, as the trademark registered, so no other band could be called The Slants. And the Patent Office said, no way. This is a disparaging term. There's a statute that says you cannot register disparaging terms. After all, the government's not in the business of endorsing these types of disparaging terms. Now, the lawyer for the band member or leader argued, look, you approved NWA, and that's pretty offensive. That's pretty disparaging. But then I suppose that NWA was in initials, and they also held, well, that's not really disparaging because no one took it that way. Now, you could see where you're headed with that. Now it's up to interpretation as to what's a disparaging. Disparagement could be in the eye of the beholder. And Tam's lawyer also argued, look, we didn't disparage anybody. We didn't disparage any particular person. Well, the Supreme Court said, look, it's a pretty broad statute. It doesn't mean disparage individually. You could disparage a group, and so therefore that part of the statute's okay. You're not really making the right argument. And the Justice Department, who was trying to uphold the patent ruling that they can't register the slants as a trademark, argued that using such a disparaging term would convey to the public that the United States regards racial slurs as appropriate. Now, the Supreme Court took a look at this, and I think they got it absolutely right. And not just because they voted unanimously. It's because they understood that the government can't get involved in determining what people can and cannot say. Now, let's go through the case and what their legal reasoning was. The Supreme Court said, look, speech cannot be banned on the grounds that expresses ideas that offend. That's true. That goes to the heart of the First Amendment. The First Amendment was there so people can say whatever they wanted, other than a few things where you would actually disparage someone to the point of defamation or libel, or you would use what's called fighting words, threats, things like that. But other than that, what they wanted when they drafted the First Amendment was that people could basically speak their minds, and that the government couldn't tell them to stop speaking. This is where it gets tricky. Someone else can tell you on a private platform to shut up, to not say that. They can have rules on what you can and cannot say. It's the government that can't have those rules. A lot of people get confused with the First Amendment. You take a comment off on their online, and they say, oh, you're violating my free speech First Amendment. No, you're not. When people have private property, they can tell you whatever they want. You don't have the right to come into somebody's house and start saying whatever you feel like. They can throw you out. But the government can't. The government is not allowed to prohibit your free speech. So a lot of people looked at this and so, yeah, so the government is not going to endorse these types of disparaging statements by giving patents on them. But here's how they broke it down. Is that first of all, the federal government does not make up the trademarks. These are people, free citizens, who bring their trademark to the United States Patent Office. It doesn't change them. And it also, the court said, can't edit them and say, look, we don't like this one because there is a statute that says we can reject it because it's disparaging. Well, the Supreme Court said that that doesn't pass muster. We can't allow the Patent Office to be the arbiter of what is acceptable and what is not. And they went as far as to say that the federal government is not endorsing these trademarks. The federal government doesn't make them up. And in fact, if it did, the decision wrote that the federal government would be babbling prodigiously and incoherently. And they gave us examples of other trademarks that had been granted. It said, for example, if trademarks represent government speech, what does the government have in mind when it advises Americans to make believe, as Sony says, or think different, as Apple says, or just do it, as Nike says, or have it your way, as Burger King, all trademarks that have been registered with the Patent Office. Excuse me. So they said registration of a mark is not government approval of that mark, and that is absolutely correct. These are private citizens and corporations who wish to bring, for whatever reason, their trademark to the federal government. Now, also, in Tam's view, the reason he wanted to register the slants was not because he clearly didn't want to disparage anybody. So in a sense, he could have won his case on the fact that the case could have been viewed the same way they viewed NWA, that people weren't going to take it that way, because what Tam had said was he wanted to reclaim the name from its derogatory past. Same with NWA. Well, so now you see where the Patent Office doesn't know whether it's to be taken on its face or whether it's to be taken on how his fans might view it. And this is where the Supreme Court says, look, we're not going to get into that. These are people who bring their trademarks. It's not government speech. It's not the government making the disparaging remarks. It is the person who is bringing the patent to the office, and they have a right to their free speech. And registration of that mark is not government approval of that mark. It's just giving the individual the protection. And if you don't allow an individual to have that protection, then they don't have the right of free speech. And the right of free speech is being denied by the government agency, which is exactly what the First Amendment is not supposed to do. The government is not supposed to tell a citizen what he or she can or cannot say. And basically, they were telling Mr. Tam, you cannot register the name The Slants because we decide that that is a disparaging term. So if the government patent office denies the content of a patent obligation, it's the government denying the free speech protections that it's supposed to have granted to its citizens through the First Amendment. So there's a case where, and then therefore the conclusion was the disparagement clause that they have in this act that says the patent office can reject any disparaging trademarks, they said that violates the free speech clause of the First Amendment. And they're absolutely right. Now, this doesn't mean that one can't hold the opinion or insist that Tam's band's name, The Slants, is offensive, derogatory, disparaging. One can easily argue that that is a disparaging name. One can argue no one should listen to them. One can argue everyone should listen to them. One can make whatever argument they want, and that's the free speech. And the government can't say that you can't make those arguments. You can't have your band called that. You can't have the protection of the trademark. However, a private company like Facebook or Twitter can decide, if they so wish, that they don't want to see the name, the slants, or anything else on their platform. And that's where you get into the argument, well, they're a private company, it's not government, they could do what they want. Then later on you can get into whether they're a quasi-government entity. But the point being is here, the case is clear. The government cannot tell an individual, cannot violate their First Amendment rights as to what they want to say especially in this narrow case, and what they want to register as their trademark. So we'll see what the impacts of that are. I think it means basically you'll see a lot of disparaging names trademarked. But again, that doesn't mean the government is approving of those marks. You can get into a whole different discussion whether the government should even be involved in trademark and patent, but that's an issue for another day. All right, let's go into the economy. 2 Italian banks required bailouts, and the economic data has remained tepid. I'll talk about those 2 Italian banks in a moment. Gold and silver. Gold closed basically flat, so did silver. Gold was up a tick, maybe about $3. Silver closed at $16.68 an ounce, just as it did the week before. The gold silver ratio, I know people are fans of this, they insist it has to come down. Well, it isn't coming down, hasn't been coming down, not the past year and not the past 5 years, and it hasn't been anywhere near 16-to-1 since Nixon took the US off the gold standard. Remember, gold was fixed at $35 an ounce from 1934 to 1971, and that's the only reason, in my opinion, that silver was actually trading close to gold on a ratio. Once they allowed the gold price to be freer and not set at $35 an ounce, gold rose. And that's very important for people to realize. They say, oh, well, silver, they're manipulated, the gold's manipulated. Yeah, they are. But people forget that from 1933 to 1971, gold wasn't manipulated. It was fixed by law at $35, whereas silver may have been manipulated during that time period, but it was allowed to rise a bit. But when one thing is for sure, even though there is manipulation, when they took off the $35 an ounce price in 1971, and they allowed Americans to buy gold starting at the end of 1974, the price definitely went above $35 an ounce. And that made the ratio, the gold-silver ratio, climb, because gold, now being maybe manipulated, but it's not being set, the price managed to go higher. And that's why you have a very high gold-silver ratio. All right. Tweets of the week. This is just a point. The reason cryptocurrencies are rising, for the most part, is especially things like the big ones, Litecoin and Ethereum and Bitcoin, it's because of Chinese and Korean buying. And that's where most of the buying takes place. Excuse me. If you look at the trading volumes on CoinMarketCap, you see they're on those Chinese exchanges. And people are insisting that's something to do with lack of confidence in the dollar. No, it doesn't. There may be lack of confidence in the dollar, but when a Chinese or Korean person buys a cryptocurrency, he or she is not buying it because they have lack of confidence in the dollar. They're buying it as a speculative asset. They're buying it as a hedge against their own currency, more so than they are against the dollar. So just because something is going up and something's attracting capital doesn't mean that that's a lack of confidence, a sign of lack of confidence in the dollar. No more than I write here that when people bought pets.com, that was a sign of a lack of confidence in the dollar. No, that was a sign of a craze into a speculative asset. Pets.com. Excuse me. Reuters headlines. What's this one here? Oh, this is just a subtle thing. I used to cover this every week. Reuters used to cover every piece of news during the Obama period as solid, robust. Everything was wonderful in the economy. And whenever there was a piece of news that wasn't that good, they would say, home prices fall unexpectedly. Investment falls unexpectedly. GDP falls unexpectedly. Well, here, Reuters says, when the U.S. existing home sales rise, they say they unexpectedly rose. Whereas if they had rose during the Obama era, they would have said solid existing home sales number, robust numbers. And if somehow they fell, they would say they unexpectedly fell. Just something to notice in the mainstream media's reporting. All right, Smaulgld during the week. This was a story, gold's remarkable store of value shown in charts. A lot of people are saying, well, gold hasn't done well the last few years. You have to look at it in the big picture. I give a 10-year, 20-year period. It shows basically if you bought in 2008 and you bought an ounce of gold every year at the average price that year, not the highest price you could possibly pay in 2011, you bought all your gold at 1911, that basically The average price of the last 10 years, if you bought an ounce of gold every year dutifully, is about the same as it is today. It's actually higher. So the average, if you bought an ounce of gold every year at the average price that year, you would have average paid $1,236. And today you can get $1,260 for that. So you haven't lost anything. That's a store of value right there in those 10 years. But if you go back 10 further years, you have a big gain. So if you smooth it out over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, you'll see 100 years, 1,000 years, gold does remain a store of value. That's not the same as, see, when people say Bitcoin's a store of value, it's not. If Bitcoin goes up, Bitcoin just, that's like saying pets.com was a store of value for 3 years when it went up. A speculative asset can't be a store of value. It can only be a store of value after it's been such for years and, in a sense, consistently above the value versus the currency you're marking the store of value against. Fed chatter, Dudley, tight labor market should push inflation higher. They're talking out of both sides of their mouth. I'm going to read these comments. You'll see. Some say we got to keep raising rates. Some say we can't keep raising rates. Some say maybe we should slow down. Dudley, inflation's going to go higher. Well, that means we better raise rates. Then Evans, I want to assure you that if we know things are going wrong, we will act, which means if the economy doesn't start to take off, well, then we'll stop raising rates. Maybe we'll cut rates. Dudley, halting tightening cycle now would imperil economy. Now, that's the argument that we have to remain hawkish. What I mentioned at the top, U.S. Mint sales update. Again, no sales again. I mean, you're talking a couple of thousand American 1 ounce gold eagle sales and a few 100,000 American silver eagle sales in the United States at the U.S. Mint. The story is different in India and China, as we've been reporting on. Very strong sales of gold in China, very strong sales of gold in India. Strong numbers and imports of silver across the world, but not in the Stati Uniti, not in the United States. All right, now here's one. Litecoin versus Bitcoin. This is the same thing. Gold, silver ratio, Bitcoin, Litecoin ratio. Litecoin is supposed to be silver to Bitcoin's gold. And for fun, I went and I looked at what the Bitcoin Litecoin ratio is. And I just threw out the numbers. You can go through this video, you'll see. If Litecoin is like silver to Bitcoin's gold, and Bitcoin is only got 4 times fewer coins available than Litecoin, well, then the ratio should be 4 to 1. Just like many gold-silver ratio people say, it should be 16 to 1 based on the relative rarity. Well, hold on a minute. Bitcoin's price is 60 times greater than Litecoin's. Its market cap is like 20 times greater. But the relative ratio of rarity is 4 to 1. This just shows that relative rarity is rarely an adequate basis for proper valuation. I can't seem to convince many silver bugs of that. They keep insisting 16 to 1, 16 to 1, as if the relative rarity was the dispositive, and therefore it has to go back to what's called a natural ratio. I give you many examples where the natural ratio doesn't work. Look, Bitcoin, Litecoin, why isn't it 4 to 1? There's many reasons. I don't have to go through them. Why isn't silver 16, gold-silver ratio 16 to 1? Many reasons. It has nothing to do with manipulation. It may have partly to do with that. That may make it higher, but it's not the only reason. And gold-platinum ratio. Why is gold trading at a higher price than platinum? Platinum's 10 times rarer. Platinum should be 10 times the price of gold. It's not. Anyway, it's interesting. You go through it. I compare the two. That doesn't mean, though, and the Bitcoin Litecoin ratios aren't out of whack, but they don't have to go to any natural ratio. That's the underlying point. All right, story on silver, the silver way, how Mexican silver coins paved a 16th century route to China. You want to check that out. More Fed chatter. This is Chicago Fed President Evans, nervous about inflation weakness, which means now he's saying, wait a minute, if the inflation isn't going up, then maybe we shouldn't raise rates. Then Rosengren on the hawkish side says low interest rates pose financial stability risk. Well, you've been doing it for 8 years. Low risk, almost no interest rates. And now they're saying these low rates pose financial stability risks. Okay. Bank of England, Carney says now's not the time to raise rates. Hungarian central bank leaves rates. So mostly around the world, you're seeing that you're seeing that the central banks have no interest in raising rates other than the U.S. Federal Reserve. Now, here's a story I came up with through VJ sent me this. It was a speech by the Bundesbank president, is also on the Bank of International Settlements. And part of his speech was dedicated to what are we going to do about these cryptocurrencies? Because, you know, these cryptocurrencies, they come along, they mess up our ability to do monetary policy. What can we do? And one of the things he said they can do, and I did a YouTube and a blog post on this, and it also got picked up in Zero Hedge. I think I'll get that. One of the things we can do is we can come up with our own cryptocurrency, and you know, and if we do it, or not our own cryptocurrency. No, he said we could just make our payment systems faster, and if we make our payment systems faster, well, you know, then people just lose interest in these cryptocurrencies, which is kind of ridiculous that that's what people want. They just want faster payment systems, and they'll forget all about cryptocurrency. And then he said, well, you know, maybe we do our own, and he noted that maybe if they did their own, that people not only would forget about cryptocurrencies, but they'd forget about dealing with their own banks, and they just put their money in the central bank cryptocurrency. So it's an interesting way that they look at it. We still have regulation to deal with, but I don't think that those are the two ways that the central banks are going to make people lose interest in cryptocurrencies, even if the interest in cryptocurrency isn't as a competing currency, but just as a speculative asset. They're attractive. The central banks have created an environment where people are hungry for yield. People are hungry for outsized gains because they can't put their money in a safe place and earn anything. So they're forced into the stock market. They're forced into speculative assets. And, you know, I would say more people than not have made money on cryptocurrencies. Now, that doesn't mean that'll always be the case, but you could see why there's a lot of capital coming into the sector, and it's because of central bank policies, plain and simple. So I don't think they get what they've done, how they've actually caused these cryptocurrencies rise. Here is the Zero Hedge, is a Smaulgld credit. Central Bank of Russia, now they're adding gold to their reserves. They added another, I don't know, I think it was 800,000 ounces in May. They also added more treasuries in April. So you can check that out. All the charts are in there. Another story, 1700-year-old Roman villa with magnificent mosaics and astounding treasures discovered in Libya. I think they found some gold, not gold, they found denarius and I think bronze coins. There's some pictures of this article. De-dollarization, China to launch second phase of cross-border interbank payment system for RMB. And China, here's, you know, I always say China is looking to become like the United States. They're issuing more and more credit. And here's a story about how they aim to boost services share in GDP to 60% by 2025. Sound familiar? Get rid of the manufacturing and move into a services economy, and then also offshore your manufacturing. So that's stuff to Africa, Southeast Asia, and import it and export your inflation via the yuan. So people thinking that China is somehow like the antidote to the United States, I would just say that it is almost a carbon copy with central planning of what the United States was 25, 30 years ago. They're going to take their competitive advantage in manufacturing and some military dominance and then use that to make other people do work for them. All right, we'll see what happens. Shanghai Gold Exchange offer yuan-backed futures contract in Budapest. May gold deliveries buoyant. I think that was in, that was in South Africa. No, it was, well, let's check where gold deliveries were buoyant. When as we go down here. Ancient tomb of gold worker found along the Nile River. Here's an interesting one. Frank Justa. This guy's an insider. He's friends with the Clintons. He was interviewed on Kitco, and she asked him, you know, he thought gold was manipulated, and he gave a very serious answer that gold is managed. And he insisted it wasn't manipulated, but I don't know what the difference is. He mentioned who manages it, and it's the same people that everybody else says manipulates it. So I think there's confirmation from this guy's in the gold industry, so he's owned mining companies before, so he understands the game. He says gold is managed. Yeah, Zimbabwe. This is where the gold deliveries were buoyant. Okay. Initial claims, no big deal there. More Fed chatter. Now here's a guy talking out of the other side of the Fed's mouth. Projected rate path is unnecessarily aggressive. Okay, well, he's not worried about not raising rates. He's not worried about financial instability. He's not worried about. He just figures, look, we don't need to raise rates that much. That's what he says. Now, Litecoin. Litecoin is the little sister to Bitcoin. There's this project. We don't know what it is. MIT will unveil a Litecoin-oriented project August 1st. We'll see what that is. We don't know what that is yet. All right. Official digital currency now yet to be issued. Florida, here it is. Florida man to be fined $1.25 per robocall. Now, supposedly he made 96 million of these things. Now, that's pretty offensive, and that guy is probably not the best friend of a lot of people who receive those phone calls. But the fine that he's going to get is it's, what do we say it was up at the top here? It is, he's going to pay $120 million for doing this. Now, he should get fined. I don't disagree. He should be fined, and I don't know what the penalty should be for what he's done. But if you just think about the $120 million, first of all, he probably doesn't have $120 million. But that's more than Deutsche Bank paid to settle their gold and silver manipulation cases. Now, granted, those weren't government. This guy is being fined by the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, but these are private settlements. But still, it just highlights that the crimes that the banks get away with and the fines they pay on a relative basis. I mean, here's a guy, I'm not defending what he's done, but he didn't pay $120 million for making phone calls. Now, that doesn't mean anybody got ripped off. That just means people were annoyed. Many people probably didn't even hear them. They went to the voicemail. And some people probably listened for a few seconds and hung up, but fine the guy. But $120 million is just, I don't know. Gold. Indian gold fetish, 300 billion worth of gold consumed in the last 10 years. Swiss gold exports jumped 39% to 170 metric tons in May on Indian demand, which is a 5-month high. As I mentioned, gold demand is strong internationally, not in the U.S. China becomes the first country in the world to test national cryptocurrency. Now, Indian banks in trouble. This was the other story we were supposed to cover. Italy to pay up to $17 billion in euros to save 2 troubled banks. Now, they weren't supposed to do this. They weren't supposed to be bailing out banks. So here they are bailing out banks. They gave Greece another bailout. And you know, if there's 2 banks, it's like cockroaches. If there's 2 banks that have come forward and need this bailout, you can be certain there are other banks in Italy that need the same treatment, and more would need it probably if they didn't bail these out, because these banks probably have all types of relationships with the other banks, and if these go under, then the others go under or have trouble. You got banking issues in Spain. So for those who are saying collapse, I understand why they say it, because the banking system is a mess. It is over inflated with debt, and the issue is, can they just continue with the bailouts and keep this thing together? Now, I had Anne Renf on. He is a Bitcoin expert and a Austrian economics, and we talked about central banks and Ethereum. He equated Ethereum in some respects to a confidence scheme. I'm not going to go into why. And we also talked about, which is something that we should all think about going forward, is, are we moving, forget cryptocurrencies as a currency, but using code and cryptocurrencies for smart contracts, for managing corporations, for managing governments. Are we moving towards this trustless society where the code is the law, and basically you don't need the executives? So in a sense, you take everyone talks about robots replacing the lower skilled workers. Well, these code-based contracts, code-based corporations could replace your fat cat CEOs, CFOs, board directors, and so on, because the code will replace all that, and everything will be done by code. Now, the question is this a good thing? Now, a lot of people would say, well, of course, it eliminates the abuses of humans. It eliminates the abuses of central banks, where they can just decide. They're not restricted by a code or a law. They just print whatever money they want. Corporations can self-deal. The board can all vote to give all the executives lots of money, lots of stock options. Well, under a code-based corporation, that would all be hard code, and they couldn't do that. However, when something goes wrong, and this is a philosophical question, but do you override the code? Is it written so that you can override it? If there's an issue with the code, are you a slave to the code? Is that just as bad as being slave to human foibles and human dishonesty? Don't know. Now we'll see how that goes. Well, thanks for listening. It's a lot for the week, and we'll see you during the week. Remember to subscribe to Smaulgld. We're almost at 2,000 YouTube subscribers. If you want to boost that up, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. Thank you very much.